During the First World War, most of the Latin American countries remained neutral during this war. Only some countries of the continent declared war, but without participating. Mexico was one of those countries that, although it didn't enter the war, had a very interesting participation, since Mexico almost entered the war, but on the side of the Germans, when the war broke out in Europe. In 1914, Mexico was facing its own conflict, the Mexican Revolution, that had begun since 1910 with the aim of overthrowing President Porfirio Diaz. The revolution was successful and he assumed the presidency Francisco I. Madero in 1911, but in 1913 he was betrayed by Victoriano Huerta, who overthrew him in a coup d'etat and shortly afterwards had him executed together with his vice president. This began a new revolution to overthrow Victoriano Huerta from the presidency. The Americans, to prevent weapons from Europe from reaching Victoriano Huerta, they occupied the port of Veracruz in 1914. And the end, Victoriano Huerta ended up being overthrown after the capture of Zacatecas by Pancho Villa, which caused him to flee to Mexico. The curious thing is that Huerta planned to return to Mexico to take power, but this time with the help of the German Empire. The Germans, already at war in Europe with France, England, and Russia, saw Mexico due to its strategic position as a possible ally since the US was neutral. But they sent armed support to the Allies, and this harmed the Germans, so they would create a conflict between Mexico and the US, so that they would stay busy and stop sending arms to England and France. In fact, Mexico and the US had bad relations at that time due to the American invasion of Veracruz in 1914. The Americans were attentive to the presence German, and that was in Mexico. Meanwhile, in Europe, great battles were taking place like the Battle of Verdun, and the war had spread. Europe was divided on several fronts in Mexico. The same were the great battles, but in the midst of the revolution, because by 1915, in Mexico, Venustiano Carranza's constitutionalists were in conflict against Pancho Villa's division of the North, as well as Emiliano Zapata's troops in the so-called War of Factions. Battles like Celaya, where up to 30,000 men participating, was one of the toughest in the Mexican Revolution. Despite being in its own conflict, it contributed in the First World War in the sale of weapons, such as the Mondragon rifle, a weapon set by Mexican Manuel Mondragon, the first semi-automatic rifle in the world. The rifle was sold to the Germans who used in the war. England managed to resist thanks to the fact that much of the oil used by the British Royal Fleet came to Mexico. In fact, up to 70% of the oil used by the British came from Mexico, so without Mexican oil, England could not fight the Germans. At sea combats, like the naval battle of Jutland, which was the best battle of this war, was possible thanks to Mexican oil, but while in Europe the war continues, in Mexico things were not good either. The revolution was still going on, and to make things worse, the March 9 of 1916, Pancho Villa with 500 men invaded US territory to capture a man who defrauded him by selling weapons in poor condition, and came to attack the US town of Columbus, where a hard battle was fought. This attack caused the indignation of the President Woodrow Wilson to not invade Mexico in order to capture Pancho Villa, and the so-called punitive expedition sending up to 10,000 Americans under the command of John Pershing. In March 1916, the Americans invaded only the state of Chihuahua in northern Mexico to capturing Pancho Villa, and despite the fact that they had horses, planes, cars, and more war equipment. It was too difficult for them. This invasion greatly annoyed the Mexican population, and President Venustiano Carranza ordered them to withdraw from the country. A war between Mexico and the US seemed imminent since various confrontations took place in 1917. The situation for the Germans in Europe was critical, since it was still going on trench warfare and both sides were greatly weakened. The Germans, fearing the United States would enter the war, sent a secret message to the Mexican government in January 1917. German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann sent a telegram to Mexico where this was proposed to the Mexican government an alliance between Mexico and the Central Powers. So Mexico will declare war on the United States, and Germany promised to send military aid, and that with their submarines they will wage submarine warfare, which was very effective in the war, since they sank many ships, including several Americans. The Germans promised that if they won the war, Mexico will recover these territories, Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, since those territories and others more Mexico lost in the war with the US in 1846. Germany, what he was looking for is that US would be distracted to that he would not get involved in the war in Europe. The telegram was sent to Mexico, but to his bad luck, it was discovered by British intelligence. But they were in doubt if they let the US know about the telegram could cause discomfort in Americans, since they would know that the British were spying on their communications, and if they didn't, they could lose a great opportunity for the United States to enter the war on their side. But the British allowed the telegram to reach Mexico. The message reached the hands of the President Venustiano Carranza. In the end, he decided to not accept the proposed military alliance with Germany. This because Mexico was not in a position to get involved in another war, since the revolution was just coming to an end and that had weakened the country too much. In addition to the fact that although Germany promised to send military aid to Mexico, they were not in a position either, since the Germans had suffered hundreds thousands of casualties and were in crisis and still at war with the French and British. The telegram said the following: "We intend to begin unrestricted submarine warfare on February 1st. We propose to Mexico an alliance on the following basis to make war together. Declare peace together. We will provide abundant financial aid and the understanding on our part that Mexico has to reconquer the lost territory with Texas and Arizona. Also, to suggest that they take the initiative and invite Japan to immediately adhere to this plan." The telegram was made known to the US government, which caused fear and indignation among the population of that country. This led to that the US broke relations with Germany and declared war on it in 1917. The telegram that sought to prevent the United States from entering the war ended up being one of the Germany's worst mistakes. The president of the US, having an alliance between Mexico and Germany, ended up recognizing Carranza as president of Mexico, and he remained neutral during the conflict. Since Venustiano Carranza feared that the United States would take the country's oil wells and end the war between Mexico and the US was avoided. In fact, the Americans had withdrawn from Mexico in February 1917 from the state of Chihuahua without being able to capture Pancho Villa. The punitive expedition had ended in a defeat for the US Army, the entry of the US into the war, a disaster for Germany, since they sent more than 1 million soldiers, but despite the fact that they were only in the conflict for a year. More than 100,000 Americans died and more than 200,000 were injured, because many were inexperienced and unsuspecting. In the end, the war ended in 1918. During the war, although Mexico didn't participate directly, there were many Mexicans who fought as volunteers in the war. This was Mexico's participation in World War I, and was why Venustiano Carranza's decision to not accept the alliance with Germany.